Hey, Tamas, great to see you again. Boy, it's been a while. You're looking, smiling as ever. Um, I understand you have a new role. Look forward to hearing some of that. But, we're going to talk about AI broadly, many dimensions. So thank you for taking the time. Let's talk about your new role first.
Yeah, Vinny, always a pleasure. And I think smiling gets through these times, whatever these times are. So that's always useful. There's chaos in the world, chaos in technology, transitions. I don't think anything is like it was a year ago. Um, and including my role. So I spent, as you know, 14 years supporting private equity firms with digital transformation. Now I moved into more of a strategy role within Automation Anywhere, and prefer perfect time for that because AI just came about. So definitely looking forward to this conversation. I'm dying to hear your perspective on this, and I certainly have mine.
So, Tamas, I think a few months ago I said, hey, let's talk AI. And he said, Vinny, let me digest a little bit more. This has a feel for blockchain, a little overhyped. You've come around. So tell me what has made you more comfortable about AI in the last 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, and let me do that. And in fact, let me go back to blockchain, which most of your listeners are going to say, blockchain, that's so yesterday, but that's the point, right? Blockchain was here like less than 10 years ago. That was everything. Every corner we turned, everything is going to be blockchain enabled, decentralized. Businesses turned it on. Consultants were having practices on this. And I remember for a while I used to tell people about this. I think it was Long Island Tea Company that changed their name to Blockchain Company in order for valuation increase. So that's how crazy it was. People forget, and and a lot of this fizzled out. In fact, the only part of blockchain that remains is the part that started it, which is the bitcoins and the cryptocurrencies and the like. And and I think it was a lot of effort.
And maybe a chain of custody in pharmaceutical in a few sectors.
A little bit of providence, yeah, fair enough. But I think when I looked at, and the technology was incredible. I think the same thing is happening with AI. Most people would argue this is very different. So there's a lot of hyperbole, and I'm actually believer that this is gonna be how we will remember when the internet came about and e-commerce and the like. However, whenever something like this happened, in my experience, I think you and I have some longer history than others. It will go through a phase of experimentation. I'm not going to quote the Gartner hype cycle. I'm just talking about what companies do. They're going to experiment. They're going to spend a lot of money on experimentation, and there's a lot of hype around all of this. And so a couple of months ago when I reached out, I said, hey, let's see if the dust settles a bit. So it settled a bit, and I think we're getting a little bit more clarity. So I think it's probably a good time to talk about it.
So I want to hear what you're seeing, but I'm seeing very different perspectives. If you talk to application vendors, their value proposition is ChatGPT is the Wild West of consumer web. We are book of record, highly sanitized data, and we've got very, very structured opportunities that we can show, right? If we talk to hyperscalers, they'll go, my God, this generative AI is really going to be uh, it's going to turbocharge low code, right? Because it's going to make DevOps just so much more efficient and so much more available to common employees in every organization. If I talk to content providers, research firms, or even consulting firms, they go, "Hey, ChatGPT applied to our content is our big killer app." So the killer app definition seems to vary depending on who you talk to. What are you seeing?
It's so funny, and I will use the cliche of the elephant and us figuring out what the elephant is, right? But I think it's so true. What I noticed in the since November, but definitely around March when everybody was catching on to Gen AI, and is everybody's trying to figure out how to connect to this phenomenon. And there's a lot of I don't have a numbers for it, but I have this sense that 80% of the people are basically APIing into OpenAI. That's their answer to their Gen AI initiative, and including vendors. So there's a lot of co-piloting going on beyond Microsoft that is basically just connecting in and having access to GPT-4 at least, because that's giant, and probably other large language models. I think there's the other things you mentioned. I noticed in the early days we had a couple of companies that came out and said this is completely in line with where we are seeing, like in digital advertising. They were one of the first I saw. There's a firm called S4 Capital, Sir Martin Sorrell's firm, that came out very early. I think it was March, April timeframe in the Times of London, saying, "Hey, we're going to be all digital. Everything we know about copywriting is gone. It's going to be all AI generated because large language models naturally yield to content generation." So that was a good fit. But the further away you are from a content generation as a business model, the harder it is. Okay, how do I relate to this technology? And that's what I'm seeing. In fact, you know, around this feeling the elephant analogy, right? So a lot of truisms emerge. One is GenAI is all about data. The more data you have, the more opportunities you have to leverage it. Except the question becomes for what, right? So I was on a healthcare panel. I think it was a couple of days ago, and one of the interesting things they talk about is 30% of all data is generated by healthcare, but they can't use it. It's just a funny fact because it's unstructured. It's traditional models. I mean, healthcare is the biggest system integration problem. So traditional ways of solving it by the ERP vendors or others didn't work. Interoperability. I can't say this word. Interoperability is one of the
Absolutely, yeah.
reasons. Right. Thank you. And I think they're looking at maybe their own version of a large language models emerging that can make sense out of all this content. And I think so. Right now, we're in a single modal kind of conversation, which is text. So you provide text, you provide prompts, and you're going to get a response. What I'm actually excited about is multimodal. So when you actually can provide, and it's happening. So GPT-4 now has it. Most of the vendors will have at least bimodal. So you're going to have image and text. But what's interesting, if you think about what you and I do all day, we look at text, we look at charts, we look at images, we look at videos, we as humans, we make sense is as far as knowledge workers, we make sense out of the world by looking at multimodal information. If GenAI can do that and generate multimodal responses, I think that's when the real shift is going to happen. We're at the beginning of that. And use case wise, I think it's going to be very interesting because it's beyond text generation, which is maybe image generation with Dolly and the like, right?
So I've been to, like you, I last 6 months, it's been like a fire hose of perspectives and so on, right? So what was interesting was at Dreamforce, two things really stood out. One is they were like, bring your own models.
Hmm.
There's so many LLMs or even small learning models, right? Vertical and so on. And they were like, bring your models. We don't want to dictate what LLM you're going to think about, right? The other thing that they said was not definitively, but they said generative AI is just a transition phase. We're going to move to autonomous agents. That is
Hmm.
going to be much more exciting in terms of productivity and so on. I think what you're seeing is go from single mode to multi mode is part of that transition. What's been really interesting is sitting down with people and saying, what is the value of data? You know, I have this question I ask. Do you think Coca-Cola, the formula that's in the safe somewhere, do you think any vendor is going to have access to that? Their machines are never going to get access to that, right? You think pharmaceutical companies are going to share their molecular data with anybody? No, right? So there's some things that are they're so important to a company, they'll never leave their data centers, or even, they may not even be digitized. They're saved somewhere where they can be accessed. Then you go down the value of different pieces of data, right? So there is customer data, revenue data that's more important. There's operational data. I'll come to operational in a minute. And then you got back office data, which is fairly down. And a lot of the use cases we're seeing are finance, HR, procurement. And you go, well, frankly, that is actually down the hierarchy of value for a lot of companies, right? So that's been interesting to see. Uh, Now, when you talk about operational data, I mean, I've had a few conversations with people who have said, predictive AI is actually getting a resurgence, and that's going to deliver a lot more value to me. If I'm in a asset-intensive industry, preventing a unplanned downtime is far more value to me than some document generated, employee profiles or whatever, right? I was talking to a retailer who said, demand forecasting has been around for many years, but now I'm seeing so many new data streams that I can feed my demand forecasting. That's what they're excited about it. I wrote about Costco a few years ago, where it was a food court application, right? Where they want to produce enough so they have enough to sell. But if it stays unsold for an hour, they have to throw the food away. So it's a balancing act. So they were looking at years of point of sale data. They had that information down cold, right? But they were including weather data that started to. They were also including gas price data because what they found was people go to their pumps a lot more if their price is 20 to 25 cents lower than anybody else's. And if they go to the pump, the chances they come into the store are higher. The chances they'll buy the pizza or hot dogs are much higher, right? But when I was talking to them, this is 5 years ago, they were like, "We're seeing so many new data streams we can include to finesse the model." That's where I see a lot of excitement is. My God, not the static models we built a while ago, like predictive maintenance. A lot of interest in rejuvenating that. And so I'm seeing traditional learning models, machine learning, and so on is getting a resurgence as part of this overall AI um, hype cycle, if you will. So that's actually encouraging. But the value of data, I don't think vendors have caught on to that. Everybody goes, "Oh, we got this AI offering." It's like, guys, look at it from a CEO's perspective. So many conflicting goals, so many conflicting use cases they have to balance out. Go back to the value, right? If your value is high, you'll get funding. If not, yeah, stand in line. So it's kind of, people say, "Oh, I'm seeing hundreds of use cases." Well, that's part of the problem. We're seeing too many use cases. How do we prioritize it?
It's so true. We could talk. You and I talked about parts of this earlier. I've seen this, like in automation itself, the business we're in, right? So if you work with a typical company, they have hundreds of use cases, but 10, 20 of them have 80% of the value. And oftentimes they didn't focus on this. So I think we have this finance HR disease around technology deployment. And I'm ex-ERP, as you know, right? So that's where companies go because it's safe. It's structured. You can work with a finance org. They know how to use technologies, and it's just funny that the example you're saying, because the savings. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at technology value creation. Very little savings come out of finance. But that's where technologies go. Is every technology that is deployed in finance versus solving real problems. And that's, I think, what you're talking about is the essence of the problem. Instead of companies saying, what is the problem we couldn't solve before? And really trying to lean in there, they say, let's experiment here, over here, where it's safe with Mary and Bobby. They're sitting in finance, they're the controller, they're structured, they can move it. And that's not where the value is. I mean, it's a funny story. I was talking to somebody in the semiconductor industry, and they said, we have this massive supply chain crisis. Talk about predictive analytics. I mean, we haven't even solved that problem in a lot of industries, let alone AI, right? And so we had supply chain problems. We had all the tools available, and semi is a good example of that, but the entire high-tech supply chain. But many of them didn't have it. Didn't have SNOP, didn't have predictive analytics, didn't have the whole.
Semiconductor fabs generate so much parametric data that it's just thrown away. They don't have enough
They don't
capability
use
to analyze it. Same thing with
it,
IoT data in so many industrial companies. If you
and
can help them,
I think that's the answer, is sort of start working back from the data and look at the data you have and the problems you haven't been able to solve and try to connect it, because I think it's a new way of thinking. I think a lot of us, myself, we think process. It's a very different way of thinking your enterprise through processes versus data, because nobody thinks from data. We think like, okay, these are the steps in my process. How can I optimize it? And I have all this data lake around me that I can tap into. Versus, why don't we start with the data? What could we get out of it? And if you started with data, you would go to customers. you would go to your supply chain. You'd never go to finance. Why? It's how hard is it? How much data you need to create a financial statement, right? So I think it's very interesting, and you're right. I think the same problems emerging around Gen AI is like, are companies going to the problems they couldn't solve before? Now some are. So in both the good and bad, right? So the good is, I mentioned earlier, the healthcare. I was on a call where they said, we have this massive amount of data and we couldn't integrate the data. So maybe we'll be able to start weaving together information in a way we didn't anticipate. So they actually look. I mean, and it's really hard to say we're going to have patient insight in a highly regulated industry. So it scares people because what if it goes bad? But I also see the flip side of it, what you mentioned about IP protection. So there's a lot of tech companies that are really afraid of uploading data. And some of them have to upload it to hyperscaler because they don't have the compute power. They can't afford to build out. First of all, they can't even get NVIDIA chips. So let alone they can't build out their inference engines. But I think this is where a lot of the challenges happen because people are afraid of the downside. They're not experimenting in areas where the highest value data is because that's dangerous, right?
To your point, I was with some real executives this week, right? And the amount of operational data they're generating is mind-boggling. They're using drones to do imaging from an asset management and from a maintenance perspective. They have trackside sensors that can, if a wheel has a bearing that is worn out, they can actually, based on heat and noise, they can actually say, "Hey, stop this train!" Right? They have so much data over thousands of miles of track and so on that that's where, frankly, their value is. And every industry is similar, right? They just there's so much data and they don't know what to do with it.
They don't know what to do. It's interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine who's in the hedge fund industry, and the hedge fund industry, depending on the what they were after, so in the retail area, they were famous for using imaging, and they
Yep.
literally took pictures of shopping malls and the like to predict traffic and freeway traffic and all of that, and correlate that with financial information. And it's a massive amount of work, and it's not easy. And you have rows of analysts. Now you can actually do this with multimodal AI. So I think you're gonna. I think a lot of this is going to pop and I'm very bullish on the financial services industry, not on banking using Gen AI, but investment firms, hedge funds, because they're going to find that economic edge that's going to drive applications that we
Great
don't
point.
think about.
Great point.
Because I think there's like, I'm very bullish on healthcare, how much it could change and transform, beyond patient outcomes like our lives, but they're the hardest industry to change. And this is they have an AI moment, and I don't know if they're going to take full advantage of it. I think what you're talking about, sensors, and I mean, we haven't taken full advantage of that in the IoT revolution that we just finished. Have we finished it? And it's the same point of what happened to all that data that was generated. And
You made a really interesting point, which is customers are afraid to upload some of the operational data. I'm actually seeing an economic angle to that, which is, why would I give it to a vendor? Why don't I sell it to them? They don't have access to, data is the new oil. They're going to refine it for me, but I should get value for my oil, and then they can make money on the refined product, right? So that's an interesting way of looking at. As a bank told me, they said, we've invested $100 billion in our IT in
mm,
the last decade. We've drilled. We can drill now and get oil ooze out from any part of the bank. Why would I just give that to a hyperscaler to mine, right? So that's going to be we're seeing some really it's early days, but we're seeing some really interesting economic issues come out. But you deal with pricing and strategy all the time. What are you seeing in terms of economics?
it's so funny on the economics. Like, as the large language models came out, I'm a old time Linux geek, so I downloaded Llama, I installed it, and then you quickly realize it doesn't run on anything I own, and at least can build a model of any size, right? So, and one of the things, and the interesting thing that's emerging now is the rich and the poor of the compute wars. because GenAI ultimately is about compute power, and it takes massive amount of resources to get into the upper echelon. So to create a training model with, where are we, a trillion nodes with GPT-4, you can't afford it. You can't build it. It costs you $1 billion. So there are going to be these mini LLMs that are very specialized for certain business problems, which is, I think, is perfectly fine. But I do think sometimes this whole narrative gets confused about general use, probably consumer or general use LLMs that are going to be at the large tech vendors. It's going to be the hyperscalers that run them because nobody else can. And there are going to be still good applications of very narrow problems that they can create LLMs for, that you can actually afford to run. It's still going to run you in the millions. That I'm aware of one model is being run in semiconducting. It's tens of millions of dollars to ultimately create the inference model and the training models. However, that's for a large enterprise, it's fine. And I think identifying where all of that fits is going to be interesting. But in general, I'm sure you see the same trade press I do. There's a lot of questions.
I'm seeing,
Depending
Tamas,
on,
let me give you three very different perspectives I've seen.
okay,
I'm summarizing them. So I've seen Wall Street analysts actually in earnings calls basically prompt a CEO, go, GPUs are premium priced. You can't even get an allotment from NVIDIA. You're going to pay a premium. Don't think you're not. How are you going to pass that on to your customers, right? So you need to be thinking about a premium in your pricing. So that's one perspective, right? I've heard from some enterprise vendors, which is our data is so sanitized, book of record, right? We deserve a premium because compared to the consumer web, we are just highly purified already, right? So that's one perspective. Then I've heard a CIO who told me, he says, Vinnie, this is my data. So vendor's going to massage it a little bit and they expect a premium to sell it back to me. So, so like I think we're going to have a lot of headbutting between Wall Street vendors and customers over the next couple of years before it settles. My view is, again, I go back to the value of data, right?
mm,
Demand and supply, like you say, there are some parts of the enterprise that have been neglected. They have so much data that if you can help them, that's going to be the highest value, right? So, but give me a few more nuggets of what you're seeing.
yeah. So I think you're right. I'm struggling with this because I fully agree with your historical vision on data and the importance of data. I think there is this trade going on between data and compute that we don't see yet, which is, and I don't know who's going to win in that. So far, I'm seeing the hyperscalers. So if you look at just the last, let's just say a year since last November, but really for the last 6, 7 months, the only people that are making money are the hyperscalers. So Microsoft is not making money, OpenAI is not making money, and certainly open source is not making money. And then every Meta and Google that are coming out with their models, they're not making money except on the cloud side. So I think for tech vendors, so Google, it makes sense for them to populate the world with open source LLMs so they can consume compute. But I think, and maybe Microsoft has the same logic. So maybe OpenAI is a loss leader with their 49% investment. That if that consumes Azure, but Azure is not the only game in town, right? But I think ultimately the economics have to work, and there are rumors about Microsoft losing money on every Copilot as well, right? So and it's unclear how the economics is going to work outside of the hyperscaler. So you're absolutely right about data, and I own the data. But if I want to take full advantage of mine my own data, how much do I have to, and who am I paying? So I'm seeing this world where we all are paying a rent to the hyperscalers, and maybe that's going to change, but that's the world we're in. And there are good movements. I mean, a couple of them has to do with the alternative chips. So part of the NVIDIA you mentioned, but obviously Google has their own
Google
chips.
has GPUs, yeah, right.
So GPU alternatives will emerge, TPUs, MPUs, but also the lower compute power kind of large language models that don't require the same kind of resources. So maybe there's going to be a resolution.
So
Um,
it sounds like the gold rush again. The people who will really
it is a
make the
gold rush.
money are the picks and shovels and Levi's jeans.
Yeah, but that's sort of why I'm not on the VC side, but I'm very skeptical about the GenAI startups that are talked about, right? Uh, not about the innovation part of it, but the economics part of it, because it's unclear how to monetize it. I mean, even OpenAI sees a cliff now with their subscription rate. So which is astonishing, because that means that they are already being cannibalized, and they haven't even gotten to massive scale. Like, I don't know where they are, 200 million maybe active users. That's not, we're not at Facebook level, right? In the social media evolution. So we're seeing this cannibalization kick in earlier, and the
Well,
question.
the first few 100 million, they blew the record book. But yeah, you're right. Can they keep scaling at that rate?
They did blow it. So, but the point is what is there enough, is there enough room for all these um, entrants to enter this space? And I think LLMs just make me funny, because you have an LLM, I have an LLM, everybody is an LLM. I think that seems to be um, a hard space to compete in, because it's a compute power game. I think business applications are the right play. I think coming up with very well, business or academic or other, like very narrow use cases, I think that's exciting. I think because we all struggle with it. After you learn how to prompt engineer a way of doing your homework, how do you use it in business? And I think that's a more interesting question.
But let's talk about. I hate to bring it up, but let's talk about ethics, AI
Ah,
ethics. I was on a panel this week, and I was like, there's so many different perspectives on that. You go first, and I'll tell you some of what I'm seeing in terms of ethics.
yeah, it's I'm very much influenced um by the DeepMind founder CEO's comment, Mohammed's comment on the outlook of AI and the ethics of it. So, and he was talking about the fact that, you know, because we can't protect information is going to be used in a variety of ways, misused, everything from obviously biased, but also weaponizing AI in a variety of ways, not necessarily physical weapons, but just using it for harmful way. And if he's scared with 10 years of AI experience, I'm really scared. But as a practical matter, I mean, what we talked about already, protecting your own IP, it's hard enough. There's a whole battle now, which is both a battle in innovation. So I see both sides of it. So the battle about protecting your own, like writers protecting their own writing. So how do you prevent from the next Game of Thrones being written based on the available context? And now large language models coming out protecting that um, um, information, like excluding content based on certain filters, which is going to be, again, both good and bad. Maybe you can start excluding things that should be included in large language models, like China is doing, right? So I think it's ethic, and this is always difficult with security, ethics, and guardrails, because both good and bad could be limited.
If you talk to academia, quite often ethics is about bias, right? Recruiting bias.
Mm.
And to me, that's like okay, it's important, but they're much bigger, to me, much bigger ethical questions. Like you said, to me, it's about responsible AI, right? Respect the fact that data belongs to a customer. Don't just, you know, trick them into sharing or mine it without necessarily disclosing what you're doing and all that. That's going to be a major battlefield, I think, coming up. Um, Another one is, I pointed out, I said, it's politicians. AI killing jobs. I mean, they just hype that thing up so much.
Mm.
That's unethical to do that. They have no idea if it's going to do it or not, but they say it because it sounds good, right? Any automation kills jobs, supposedly. But
Yeah.
I wrote a book a few
Don't
years
get me
ago.
started on the last one. We're after how many generations of technology? We're still at 4% unemployment. So it sort of didn't happen yet, but it could happen.
I wrote a
Um,
book a few years ago where, I looked at 100 years of automation, and funnily, I could find only one occupation that automation has just about killed. It's the elevator operator.
oh,
And even that, somebody said Madison Square Garden still has a human operating the elevator, right? So But the funny thing was, I looked at UPC codes. They were patented first in 1948, and they didn't become mainstream in grocery stores till the 90s, right? And even and there, because consumer good companies found that they could come up with multiple flavors, multiple colors, and so on, they exploded the number of SKUs, and retail actually increased in volume. They ended up needing more, you know, shipping folks and stocking folks, loading folks. So, you know, to me, automation of any kind tends to target tasks, not complete jobs. So it changes jobs more than anyway. But try explaining that to a politician. Sounds much better to say, "Oh yeah, it'll kill jobs."
Yeah, it's interesting. So that's a debate, and a very common ethical debate, right? Um, but yeah, I'm bullish like you are. But going back to the general ethical questions, I love what Anthropic is doing with Claude and Claude 2, right? Because the whole approach is we building it from the bottom up to be, I mean, to be ethical, to be fair, to be, you know, supportive. It's interesting. Like Microsoft now came up with a bug bounty. So if you can trick our AI into doing anything harmful, we pay you money. But that's sort of it's a filtering mechanism at the tail end of it versus sort of start thinking about AI as I'm building it in a certain way, which is I think, I mean, my hunch is that Anthropic is going to be unique because we're in such a gold rush. I don't think companies have the patience to really be thoughtful about it, and they're just rushing to answers. And I'm not even critiquing that. That's just the nature of the gold rush we're in. So I think there needs to be a lot of mechanism around uh, what to protect. And this is the problem. I think any ethical questions become political questions. Therefore, it's going to be really hard to resolve because anything we're talking about, you could have two sides of the discussion, and technologies are terrible at resolving political or ethical debates in my assessment. So maybe you have a different view.
The one good thing I've seen with enterprise vendors is all of them are appointing an AI czar. The quality of these people, Cyan, who's now the development president at Workday, um, Carla at Salesforce. These are really impressive executives. I mean, just from a brain power perspective, certainly, just blow your mind. So that's good to see. Somebody said the U.S. has a 5-year advantage over the rest of the world. I don't know if it's that much, but it's good to see some really, really smart people that are tackling some of the issues.
It's interesting you say about the advantage because I think that could be naive. I think the U.S. plays all technology competition in the open. It's in open source. It's on GitHub. Like you see what's going on. You don't know what's going on elsewhere. We certainly don't know what's going on in
True,
China. Um,
true.
it was interesting to see from I think somewhere from the Emirates where they came up with a brand new large language model. It was as good as GPT 3.5, right? So oftentimes we don't see this coming. It's just gonna pop up, and I think this is a place where I think we should be humbler. And if you think
You
about,
know that,
yeah.
Tamas, you make a great point. I was talking to a VC who invests in Africa, and he was saying, the great thing that hyperscalers have done is they have democratized DevOps.
Hmm.
So you go to Kenya and you find talent that is almost as good as
Mm.
in
Yeah,
Silicon Valley, right? And so that you're right. We need to be a little more humble about that.
I think so.
What
So,
else? Final thoughts.
um, eh, this is different than blockchain. I do think so. I think everybody's in the game, which is new. You don't have like whole factions or of society fighting it, like what happened to financial services fighting blockchain, for example. So I think that's a good sign. I think there are risks, but I think everybody's worried about them. So I think there's something constructive is going to come out of it. but I've in my lifetime I've never seen anything, not even in the internet day, the early internet days. Nobody just started putting up e-commerce sites. Everybody was like waiting, see how this works out for Amazon and the like. This is like everybody's in on the game. So maybe it's an accelerated innovation cycle this time around. Just that's my sense, which makes me excited.
Tomas, to your point about the so many people starting off at the same time. Somebody made a comment. If you look at the cloud evolution, the on-prem vendors lost 5 or 6 years, right? Even they are jumping into AI at the same time as the cloud vendors. So, and then you have a new generation of AI vendors, right? So it is, the margin of difference is much lower than in previous cycles.
Yeah. Yeah, so the good news is, so maybe my parting thought. I mean, I just had a consultant pitching me on is your 5-year Gen AI strategy, and it's laughable because I don't know if you can come up with a 3-month one, but I think it's going to be a space we'll be watching closely. So maybe you and I can check in another 6 months and see where we see things.
I would love that. We may both say, "Oh my God, how stupid do we sound?"
They're like,
Thank
all
you so
right.
much.
Thanks, Vinnie, as always.